In the shadowed streets of Gilded Age New York, where power was traded in silence and marriages were sealed like contracts, one young woman was given away as punishment. Alice Bennet, disgraced by defiance, was handed to Charles Whitmore, a widowed magnate whose heart had long been buried in grief. Yet behind the marble walls of his mansion, a storm began to brew, one that would test pride, awaken forbidden tenderness, and pit duty against desire. Tonight, you will step into a tale of betrayal, redemption, and love, reborn through fire and rain. Tell me, where are you listening from, and do you believe that love can truly rise from punishment into blessing? New York City, in the year 1882. The winter air wrapped Gramercy Park in a pale, silvery mist, and the sound of carriage wheels echoed like distant thunder over the cobblestones. Beneath that sky of muted grey, Alice Bennet descended from the carriage her father had sent without a word of farewell. Her gloved hands trembled against the polished wood as she stepped down, her modest travelling cloak of dark wool doing little to shield her from the biting cold. The mansion before her rose like a marble sentinel, its tall windows shuttered, its iron gates heavy and ornate, its silence deep enough to carry the weight of an unspoken verdict. Inside, the marble floors gleamed with an almost cruel perfection. Gas lamps flickered along the corridor, their light dim and golden, casting elongated shadows across the portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch her with distant judgment. Alice's heart beat hard beneath the bodice of her dove-grey gown, its high collar trimmed with lace worn thin from careful mending. She had chosen it deliberately, hoping for dignity rather than display, yet the echo of her boots on the polished stone sounded like that of a prisoner entering a court of law. Charles Whitmore awaited her in the grand drawing-room, a tall figure framed by velvet curtains drawn against the winter light. His frock coat of charcoal wool hung perfectly from broad shoulders, a gold watch chain glinting faintly across his waistcoat. His face bore the kind of composure only grief can teach, the stern planes softened only by the streaks of silver at his temples. He did not come forward to greet her. He merely inclined his head, as one might to acknowledge the arrival of a shipment rather than a bride. Alice lowered her eyes, aware of the two girls standing near the piano. The elder Claraara was on the cusp of womanhood, her dark hair tied with a black ribbon, her eyes grey and sharp like steel. She held herself with a rigid grace, as if daring Alice to step closer. The younger, Emily, with her golden hair and pale blue eyes, clung to her sister's sleeve, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the fire, but her expression hesitant, almost frightened. "Miss Bennet," Charles said, his voice low and measured, "this house is your home now." He did not call her by her new name. He did not say welcome. The words fell like a verdict across the room, and Alice felt them in her bones. She inclined her head, her bonnet casting a shadow over her face. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. She could not call him husband. Not yet. The silence that followed stretched between them like a cord too tight to hold. A maid entered quietly and took Alice's small carpet-bag. She was led up a sweeping staircase to a guest chamber, though it bore the unmistakable mark of a room prepared in haste. No flowers, no personal touch, only the faint scent of lavender used to mask disuse. From its window she could see the park below, the bare trees like black lace against the snow. Somewhere in the distance, a carriage rolled away, and she knew it was her father's retreating, leaving her to a life decided without her voice. Later, as she descended to dinner, the hallways felt colder than the winter night outside. Gaslight trembled against the gilt frames of family portraits. Her eyes were drawn to a small door slightly ajar, where she glimpsed Clara's room. On the dresser sat a music box, exquisite and closed, its lacquered surface catching the flicker of the lamps. Clara turned quickly, shutting the door with a soft but decisive click, and the image stayed with Alice like a question she could not yet ask. At the table, silver gleamed under candlelight. Charles spoke little, and when he did it was about business. Figures and shipments, iron and rails, as though the woman sitting across from him were invisible. Clara and Emily ate in silence, glancing at Alice with a mixture of curiosity and distrust. The atmosphere was not one of family, nor of celebration, but of a household bound by duty and grief. When the meal ended, Charles rose, gave a curt nod, and left the room. Clara whispered something to Emily, who stifled a small sob and excused herself. Alice remained seated, hands folded in her lap, the sound of the ticking clock on the mantelpiece echoing like a heartbeat in the emptiness. She walked back to the marble entryway, where the firelight faded into shadows. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished floor, a woman, not a wife, a guest, not a companion, a punishment, not a partner. Outside, the mist thickened, swallowing the faint glow of the street lamps. In that silence, Alice understood with a clarity colder than the air outside. She had not been chosen. She had been given. The morning after her arrival, Alice awoke in a bed too large for one woman and too cold for comfort. The pale light of a grey sky filtered through brocade curtains, casting long shadows across the high, plastered ceiling. The chamber had an air of wealth that did not welcome. Heavy mahogany furniture polished to mirror-like sheen, velvet drapes of moss green, and a vanity with silver brushes laid out as if awaiting a mistress who had not yet arrived, or one who never truly would. The air smelled faintly of lavender and rosewater, though neither bloom could be found in the frost-bitten garden below. She rose in silence, dressing with care in a high-collared morning gown of muted lilac wool trimmed with lace, her hair drawn back into a modest chignon. There was no maid to assist her. The house, though grand, seemed to operate on a quiet that bordered on eerie. Downstairs, the ticking of clocks and the distant sound of servants' footsteps formed the only melody. Her first days in the Whitmore mansion passed like hours trapped in amber, still, glistening and untouched by warmth. Each room she entered felt preserved, as though time had been instructed to halt in reverence to a memory. In the drawing-room, above the marble mantel, hung a grand oil portrait of a woman in ivory satin, seated on a chaise, her gloved hands resting lightly on her lap, her gaze direct and gentle. Eleanor. The name was never spoken, but her presence weighed heavily on every corner of that house. The late Mrs. Whitmore had been beautiful. Of that Alice had no doubt. Her hair was fair, her posture regal, her face composed in that quiet, angelic serenity one only finds in the painted dead. It was not just in the portrait that Eleanor lingered. In the music room, her sheet music remained stacked in neat piles. A crystal perfume bottle stood on a silver tray near the parlour window, still half full. Her gowns were said to remain behind locked doors in the master suite. Even the servants walked more softly near her things, as if afraid to disturb the air she once breathed. Charles did not speak of her. In fact, he spoke little at all. Most mornings Alice saw him only in passing, dressed in a dark overcoat, tall hat in hand, gloves pulled on with practiced efficiency. His eyes, those storm-grey eyes, rarely met hers, and when they did, it was without invitation. He left early for his offices on Broadway and returned only after dark, often after the children had gone to bed. Alice turned her attention to the girls, determined, if not to be accepted, at least to be understood. Emily, with her soft hands and inquisitive gaze, was more pliable. She would occasionally follow Alice in the hallways, watching her arrange the flowers in the morning or help the cook with menus. When Alice offered to read to her in the afternoons, Emily hesitated, then accepted. But Clara was stone. One afternoon, as Alice entered the solarium, she found Clara seated with a book open on her lap. The glass panes above them glowed golden from the lowering sun, catching the sheen of the young girl's dark hair. Clara did not look up. "I wondered if you'd like to walk in the garden with me," Alice offered, her tone even, gentle. Clara turned a page with deliberate slowness. "You don't need to pretend." "I'm not pretending." "You are," the girl replied, eyes still fixed on the page. "You smile at us like we're dolls, and you walk around this house like you belong in it." Alice stood still, her breath caught halfway between her chest and her throat. "I know I don't belong, Clara, but I would like to." Clara looked up then. Her eyes, mirror images of her father's, were sharp with grief, edged with something older than her years. "You can't replace her," she said. "No matter how you dress or how softly you speak, you'll never be our mother." "I'm not trying to be," Alice answered quietly. "I'm only trying not to be a stranger." That night, Alice dined alone. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and heavy velvet curtains, felt cavernous in her solitude. The candles flickered in their crystal holders, their golden flames casting shadows that danced with no music. She had eaten no more than a few bites of her roast when the butler stepped in with a silver tray. "A letter, ma'am." Alice took it, her fingers trembling. The seal was unfamiliar. Inside, penned in fine script, was an invitation, the annual Marwood Ball, to be held at the Park Avenue estate of Senator and Mrs. Marwood the following Saturday. It was, she knew, one of the grandest events of the season. Charles' name was written beside hers on the envelope. A breath of hope stirred within her. Perhaps this was the beginning of recognition, of being seen not just as a burden, but as a presence. Perhaps Charles had included her in his social plans. She placed the invitation on her vanity with reverent care, already imagining the scent of perfumed gloves and the rustle of silk under gaslight chandeliers. The following evening after dinner, Alice found the courage to ask him. "I received the Marwood invitation," she said carefully, her eyes fixed on the embroidery of the parlour carpet. Charles, seated in his armchair, did not look up from the papers he was reviewing. "Yes, I will attend." She waited. The silence stretched. "I thought," she began, then faltered. "Will I accompany you?" His pause was so long she thought he hadn't heard. Then, without lifting his gaze, he replied, "No, that will not be necessary." The word struck with cold finality. Alice felt the blood drain from her cheeks, but she forced her hands to remain still in her lap. When Saturday came, she stood at the window in the upstairs corridor, watching the gas lamps along the street flicker to life. She saw Clara descend the stairs in a silk gown of deep sapphire, her hair curled and pinned with silver combs. Emily followed in a white muslin dress, her cheeks pink with excitement. Charles, tall and impeccable in his black formal tailcoat, offered his arm to his daughters. No one looked up at the window. Alice remained there long after the carriage disappeared into the fog. She returned to her chamber, removed her gown, and stood barefoot by the fire in her nightdress. Her reflection in the mirror seemed unfamiliar, paler, thinner, smaller. She crossed the room and opened the drawer of her vanity, pulling out the Marwood invitation she had so carefully preserved. She held it above the flame. The paper curled, blackened, and crumbled into ash. Only then did the tears fall, quiet and slow, down her cheeks. Downstairs, Eleanor's portrait still hung in silence, untouched by time, untouched by grief. And above, Alice stood alone in a house that did not know her name. The morning had arrived with an oppressive stillness, the kind that seemed to cling to the walls and hang in the air like a held breath. The sky above Gramercy Park was colourless, a pale veil of cloud that refused to break. Inside the Whitmore mansion, tension stirred quietly beneath the rituals of daily routine. Silver polished, linens changed, fires stoked, but the atmosphere remained taut, as though something unspoken coiled itself tighter with each passing hour. Alice had risen early, her thoughts restless and her heart heavy with the weight of absence. The absence of welcome, of kindness, of place. She wandered the corridors as one might drift through a dream that never fully belonged to them. The echo of her steps across the marble floor felt too loud, too foreign. When she passed the music room, she paused. The door was ajar. On the polished piano lay a small ribbon, blue satin, childlike, fraying slightly at one edge. Emily's, perhaps. Alice reached for it, her fingertips brushing the smooth keys. One note sang into the air, faint and solitary. A sound of hurried steps broke the quiet. "Mamma's perfume is gone!" cried Emily from the top of the staircase. Her voice trembled. "The bottle in the parlour, it's empty!" Alice turned quickly, startled by the panic in the child's voice. Clara was close behind, her face pale and stern. "No one touched your mother's things," Clara said sharply, though her voice faltered as she said the word mother. "You probably spilled it yourself." "I didn't." Emily's eyes filled with tears, large and helpless. She wouldn't want her scent to disappear. Then, without warning, the little girl bolted down the stairs and out the front door before anyone could stop her. Her small figure vanished into the grey light, swallowed by the garden paths. "Emily!" Clara shouted, running after her but stopping short at the threshold, as though uncertain whether to follow. Alice, without hesitation, gathered her skirts and hurried past Clara into the cold. The garden beyond the house was vast and sculpted, its gravel paths winding through leafless trees and frozen fountains. The marble benches glistened with frost, and the wind had picked up, scattering brittle leaves across the flower beds. Alice called Emily's name, her voice carried away by the breeze. A sharp gust whipped her cloak back, and at that very moment the sky gave way. Rain. Not the soft mist of morning, but a sudden, urgent downpour that soaked the earth and turned the gravel dark and slick beneath her boots. Alice pushed forward through the storm, her heart pounding as the rain plastered her hair to her forehead and seeped through the seams of her dress. "Emily!" she cried again, louder this time. Near the far edge of the garden, just beneath the massive oak tree with its gnarled branches stretched like ancient arms, she saw her. Emily was crouched at the base of the tree, her small figure trembling, her pale dress already sodden and clinging to her frame. Alice ran to her, breathless, drops blurring her vision. She fell to her knees in the mud beside the girl and wrapped her arms around her without hesitation, holding her close, shielding her from the rain with her own body. "I'm here," she whispered. "You're not alone. I'm here." Emily sobbed against her shoulder, the kind of tears that came from too many days of holding back too much sorrow. Her tiny hands clutched Alice's sleeves, her cries muffled by the wind. And then the sound of boots against wet stone. Alice looked up and saw him. Charles. He approached them not with fury, but with urgency. Rain poured over him, soaking his overcoat, matting his dark hair to his forehead. His breath was visible in the cold, and for the first time his mask of reserve cracked. His eyes found Emily first, then Alice, both shivering, both soaked, both clinging to each other as though shipwrecked in grief. Without a word, he removed his coat. It was a gesture simple in action, but monumental in meaning. He stepped closer and draped the heavy wool over Alice's shoulders, enfolding her and Emily in its warmth. His hands lingered for a moment, resting over hers, pressing the coat to their backs as the rain battered down around them. Alice met his eyes. There was silence between them, broken only by the rhythm of the storm. Their breath mingled in the cold air. He was too close. She could feel the warmth of his body beneath the wet linen, could see the drop of water trembling on his eyelashes. Something in him had softened, something buried deep. Then his hand lifted, brushing a soaked strand of hair from her cheek. She did not move. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes, wide and unguarded, held his. There was no distance now. No mourning wife watching, no whispers of obligation, only the quiet thrum of something unspoken rising between them. And in the next breath, it happened. A kiss, not urgent, not fevered, but slow, tentative, like the first flame kindling after a long winter. His lips brushed hers, barely touching, then pressed more firmly, with a restrained longing that spoke of silence endured too long. Alice's eyes closed. The cold vanished. The rain vanished. The ache inside her chest seemed to still beneath the weight of that single, quiet surrender. When they parted, she did not step away. She remained there beneath his coat, Emily resting between them, the storm continuing to rage in the world beyond the tree. And then, a gasp. They turned at the same time. Clara stood a few paces away, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale. Her eyes, wide with shock, filled with tears that fell freely, tears not of fury but of pain, of longing, of recognition. She turned and fled toward the house, her sobs swallowed by the rain. Charles took a step forward as if to call after her, but no words came. His arm dropped to his side. Alice's hands remained over Emily's back, holding her close, though her gaze followed Clara's retreat with a silent dread blooming in her chest. When they returned to the mansion, soaked and shivering, no words were spoken. A maid met them in the foyer, her expression unreadable, and quickly led Emily to change. Alice stood in the marble hall, still clutching the damp coat around her, her eyes trailing droplets down her lashes. Charles paused beside her. For a moment he seemed as though he might speak, might reach out, might acknowledge what had passed beneath that tree, but the moment passed. He turned and ascended the stairs, rainwater marking his steps like fading footprints. Alice remained alone, but something had shifted. Not in the house, not yet, but in her, and perhaps, too, in him. Winter deepened in New York City, wrapping the streets of Gramercy Park in a blanket of brittle cold. Frost laced the iron gates, and the bare branches of trees stood stark against the grey sky like the bones of a forgotten dream. But inside the city's warmest parlours, tongues were anything but frozen. The name Alice Whitmore, for they had begun, mockingly, to call her so, slipped from painted lips and circled crystal glasses like the smoke of a scandal just lit. In salons dressed in brocade and perfumed with the latest imports from Paris, the women of Fifth Avenue leaned in with delight behind their fans. They whispered of the girl from nowhere who had snared the widowed Whitmore with more than just her manners. And in gentlemen's clubs, thick with cigar smoke and brandy, the men chuckled and nodded with a cynical understanding of such affairs. "She must be clever," one remarked, tracing the rim of his glass. "Or desperate, or both." In truth, Alice heard none of these words directly, but she felt them. She felt them in the stares that lingered too long during Sunday service, in the tight smiles and polite silence that fell when she entered the pew. She felt them in the absence of invitation cards delivered to the mansion, in the sudden vacancies at the charity luncheons she had been told to attend. She had become an echo no one wished to entertain, too scandalous for friendship, too silent to defend herself. One afternoon, as she walked through Gramercy Park, escorted only by the ever-watchful Mrs. Holbrook, the family's aging housekeeper, two ladies passed her on the path. Their voices dropped, but not quite low enough. "She certainly doesn't look like a seductress," one said behind a gloved hand. The other laughed. "That's how they win. Soft faces and sad eyes. The grieving men never see it coming." Alice kept walking, her chin raised, her hands clasped tightly over the muff, resting against her dark green wool cloak. She said nothing, but her cheeks burned from more than the wind. When she returned to the mansion that day, her steps were slower. The parlour was empty, the fire low. Emily was upstairs with her governess, and Clara, she had been told, was composing letters. Alice stood for a moment in the centre of the room, uncertain what to do with her hands, with her breath, with the ache building quietly in her chest. The door opened behind her. Charles entered, removing his gloves with methodical precision. His overcoat was still damp at the shoulders, and his face carried the weariness of one burdened by more than business. "I passed Senator Marwood on Broadway," he said without looking at her. "He mentioned your name." Alice turned toward him, her heart already shrinking. "And what did he say?" "That he hoped I found what I was looking for," Charles replied, his tone flat. He set his gloves down on the desk, then finally met her gaze. He used the word ambitious. Alice said nothing. She did not need to. Her eyes, wide and wounded, said more than defense ever could. Charles looked away first. "These people have long memories and short loyalties." "Do you believe them?" she asked, her voice soft. He did not answer. That evening the silence between them returned, familiar now, but no less cutting. During dinner, Clara spoke little, her gaze alternating between her plate and her father. Emily, sensing the tension, fidgeted in her chair and excused herself early. Alice remained seated after the meal, alone with Charles in the great dining room, the candles burning lower, their flames trembling in the stillness. "They judge me for stepping into this house," she whispered. "They say I climbed into your life for gain. But I was pushed, Charles. Not by you, but by those who gave me no other path." He looked at her then, truly looked. And for the briefest moment, a trace of something flickered in his eyes. Regret, perhaps, or confusion. Before he could respond, the butler entered quietly and handed Charles a card on a silver tray. He glanced at it, then back at Alice. "Victor Leland has requested an audience," he said, his brows drawing together. "He's downstairs." Alice's breath caught. She had heard the name before, whispers from servants, a mention at a dinner. A rival in business, a man of considerable influence and dubious charm. But more than that, she had seen something in the way Charles's jaw tightened whenever Leland was named. A past, not yet resolved. Charles left the room without another word. Alice remained motionless for several minutes before her curiosity overcame her hesitation. She moved toward the stairs, her footsteps soundless. From the second-floor landing, she looked down into the drawing room. Victor Leland stood near the fireplace, tall and well-groomed, his overcoat draped over his arm. His hair was dark, his moustache finely trimmed, and his smile the kind that never touched the eyes. Charles stood opposite him, arms crossed, his posture rigid. "I only came to offer advice," Leland was saying, his voice smooth, practiced. "The whispers are growing louder. You know how these things go. The boardrooms, the investors, they're fickle. Their confidence erodes with every scandal." "She is not a scandal," Charles replied, his voice low but firm. "Not to you, perhaps," Leland countered, taking a step closer. "But to them, she is, and perception is everything. You can't afford doubt right now, not with the merger in Boston pending." There was a long silence. Then Leland added, "Let her go, quietly. You don't need to divorce her. Just send her away for a while. It would speak volumes. It would protect your position." Alice turned from the railing, heart pounding. She descended the servants' staircase instead, exiting through the rear of the house into the freezing air. She walked the length of the garden, past the now barren rose bushes and the stone benches, past the tree where the storm had once witnessed something tender. At the edge of the garden stood the greenhouse. She entered it not for the warmth, it was barely above freezing, but for the solitude. She sat on the low stone ledge and buried her face in her hands. She did not cry, but her breath came fast and shallow. The next day, Victor Leland returned, not to Charles, to her. Alice had been in the front parlour arranging books on the shelf when the maid entered, her expression uncertain. "Mr. Leland requested a word, madam," she said. "In private." Alice hesitated, then nodded. He waited in the drawing room exactly where Charles had stood the night before. The fire was lit now, casting amber light across the room. "You must hate me," he said without preamble. Alice stood still near the doorway. "I don't know you well enough for hatred." He smiled faintly. "Fair." He stepped closer. "You don't belong in this world, Mrs. Whitmore, and I don't say that cruelly. I say it with clarity. These people, they don't forget. They won't ever forgive you for stepping into a seat they had reserved for one of their own." "And you?" she asked, voice firm. "What is it you want from me?" "To help," he said, "and to protect Charles." She flinched. "I know what you think," he continued, "but believe me, there's a way out of this that doesn't end with you broken and him disgraced. Go away quietly. Take a generous settlement. Let him salvage what remains of his reputation. You'd be doing more for him than staying ever could." Alice stared at him. Her hands were clenched at her sides, but her voice was calm when she answered. "Tell your friends in the drawing rooms," she said, each word precise, "that I may have come through the back door, but I will not leave through it." She turned and walked away, but long after he left his words remained, planted like doubt, watered by fear, and in the shadows of that great house the whispers never truly ceased. Snow had begun to fall again over New York City, blanketing the cobblestone streets and black wrought-iron fences with a softness that disguised the biting cold beneath. The Whitmore mansion stood shrouded in silence, its windows aglow with faint candlelight, its walls too thick to betray the murmurs of fate shifting inside. It began with a cough, not a loud or violent sound, but a dry, persistent scratch in Emily's throat that grew sharper with each passing hour. By the third morning, her cheeks were flushed with unnatural colour, and her forehead burned beneath Alice's palm. The household physician was summoned at once, his face grim as he pulled his stethoscope from its worn leather case. "Fever," he declared softly, buttoning his gloves after examining the child. "Possibly influenza. Her lungs are clear for now, but you must watch her closely. No exertion, no drafts, rest and careful nursing. The next 48 hours will tell." Alice stood by the door, her hands clenched tightly at her sides, the air thick with dread. Emily, too weak to sit up, blinked slowly at her with glassy blue eyes. Clara, standing on the opposite side of the bed, looked at the physician with a composure far beyond her 14 years. "Will she be all right?" she asked, voice steady. He hesitated, with care. But Alice heard what he did not say. Charles was away that day, attending a meeting in Boston. Word had been sent, and a telegraph dispatched, but there would be no immediate return. And so, in his absence, the weight of Emily's care fell upon the household and upon Alice. The nurse assigned to Emily was efficient but distant, her instructions methodical, her presence impersonal. By the afternoon, Alice could bear it no longer. "I'll stay with her," she said firmly. The nurse frowned. "Madam, it would be unwise. Exposure to fever—" "She's a child," Alice interrupted. "And she is not to face this night alone." The nurse said nothing more. Alice removed her gloves and cloak and sat beside Emily's bed, brushing the damp hair from her brow with fingers soft and trembling. Clara stood silently by the window, watching the snow fall beyond the frost-glazed glass. "I can read to her," Alice offered. Clara hesitated, then nodded. They sat in near silence while Emily dozed, her breathing shallow, interrupted now and then by a soft moan. Alice read from Little Women, her voice barely above a whisper, pausing when the child stirred and pressing a damp cloth gently to her forehead. Clara watched from across the room, her gaze unreadable. As night descended, the fire crackled low. The lamps were dimmed. The nurse returned briefly, then left again. It was past midnight when Clara spoke. "You love her," she said quietly. Alice looked up. "Yes, I do." Clara studied her for a long moment. Then she nodded once and left the room. Alone, Alice remained seated by the bedside, her hand resting lightly over Emily's, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The minutes passed like hours, the house wrapped in stillness. The child stirred fitfully, murmuring incoherent words in her sleep. At some point in the deepest part of the night, Alice succumbed to weariness. Her head leaned forward until it rested beside Emily's on the pillow, her breathing soft and even. It was then that Charles returned. He arrived in the dead of night, snow clinging to the shoulders of his overcoat, his boots slick with melted slush. He did not wait for his valet. He went directly to his daughter's chamber, the anxiety of a father overpowering all sense of formality. When he entered, the fire cast a soft golden light across the bed, and there he saw them. Alice, asleep in the chair, her head bowed beside Emily's. One arm lay protectively over the child, the other curled near her own chest, fingers pale with cold. Her face, even in rest, was touched by worry. Charles stood motionless in the doorway, his breath caught. He had never seen her look so still, so present, so necessary. A wind from the corridor stirred the edge of the drapery. He stepped forward. Kneeling slowly, he slipped one arm beneath Alice's knees and the other behind her shoulders. She stirred, but did not wake. Her head rested lightly against his chest as he lifted her with quiet strength. As he turned toward the hallway, a sudden crack echoed through the chamber. A weight shifted on the wall, and then, with a sound like thunder, Eleanor's portrait fell. The gilded frame struck the floor with a deafening crash, glass splintering across the wooden planks. Alice jolted awake in his arms, her breath catching. Charles froze. Servants arrived at once, startled by the sound. Clara stood in the doorway seconds later, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. No one spoke. The portrait lay face down on the floor, the canvas torn where the frame had cracked. Dust settled in the air like falling ash. Charles slowly lowered Alice to her feet. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper. Uncertainty, disbelief, a quiet fear. He looked back, not with blame, but with something far more dangerous. Longing. The servants began to move toward the fallen painting, but Clara stepped forward. "Leave it," she said softly. They did. The next morning, news of the portrait's fall spread through the household like perfume spilled on silk, slow, lingering, impossible to remove. By evening, the whispers had taken flight beyond the mansion's walls, that Charles Whitmore had lifted his wife's successor in his arms, that the portrait of his beloved Eleanor had fallen, shattered, that a new chapter had begun, unspoken, but visible in the way the master of the house now looked at the woman no one expected to stay. And not all who heard were pleased. The snow had melted into thick grey slush along the edges of Gramercy Park, and a dull wind carried the scent of ash and damp stone through the city. Winter was no longer sharp. It had grown heavy, clinging to windows and thoughts like soot. Inside the Whitmore mansion, the silence between walls had changed its weight. It was no longer the hush of mourning, but the quiet of something waiting to be named. Alice moved through the house with a sense of unease she could not yet name. Though no new words had passed between her and Charles since the night of the portrait's fall, his eyes lingered longer now when they met hers. His silence no longer wounded, it unsettled. It carried weight, yes, but also restraint, as though a decision were being carved slowly within him, word by careful word. It was Clara who opened the door, not to conversation, but to possibility. That morning, Alice found her in the music room sitting alone at the piano. The child's fingers hovered over the keys, not pressing them, just resting. She did not turn when Alice entered. "I haven't played since she died," Clara said, her voice so quiet it nearly vanished. Alice remained near the door, uncertain whether she had been invited in. Clara's hands moved then, and a single note escaped, tender, hesitant. She turned slowly, looking not at Alice, but at something just beyond her. "She gave me something before she passed. A music box. I used to wind it at night. After the funeral, I locked it and never opened it again." Alice stepped forward, slowly. "Do you still have the key?" Clara nodded. "It's in the drawer beside it, but I never had the courage." The room held its breath. Alice sat beside her, not touching, not crowding, just presence. After a moment, Clara stood. "Come with me." They walked together up the grand staircase, past Eleanor's empty bedroom and into Clara's own. The room was, as always, precise, muted, elegant in a way that spoke of wealth and discipline. But on the dresser stood the music box, a lacquered piece of polished mahogany with delicate golden inlay, its shape oval, feminine, discreet. Clara reached into the side drawer and produced the key, a simple bronze one on a thin ribbon of faded silk. Her hand trembled as she passed it to Alice. "You open it." Alice hesitated. "Are you sure?" Clara nodded once. Alice inserted the key. The lock turned with a soft click. As the lid opened, the soft chime of a lullaby spilled into the air. It was a haunting melody, delicate and slow, the kind one might remember from childhood dreams. Inside the box was a velvet-lined interior holding a small brooch, a ring with a sapphire stone, and a folded letter sealed with wax. Alice's breath caught. She looked to Clara. The girl's eyes were fixed on the letter, her jaw tight. "I never noticed it," Clara whispered. "I never looked." Alice picked it up with reverent fingers. The seal bore the initial E. She turned it over, and on the outside, in graceful script, were the words, "To Clara and Emily, should he ever love again." The silence in the room thickened. Alice stood. "Would you like to read it together?" Clara shook her head. "You read it first." Alice unfolded the parchment with care. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear, written with a steadiness that made Alice's hands tremble. "My dearest girls, if this letter finds you, then perhaps time has given your father what I could not. Love deserves a second chance, even when the first was filled with silence. I loved your father in the only way I knew how, but I was afraid of losing myself, afraid of being vulnerable, afraid of giving too much and receiving too little. But if he finds someone with tenderness in her eyes and patience in her touch, please let her in, let her love you, let her love him. I do not want the memory of me to imprison him. I want it to free you." With all the love I never learned to show, Eleanor Alice's vision blurred. Her hands shook as she closed the letter and pressed it to her chest. She could not speak. Clara had risen and now stood at the window, her back to the room. After a long pause, she asked, "What did it say?" Alice took a breath. Her voice, when it came, was soft and broken. "She wanted you to open your hearts. If ever your father found someone worthy, she wanted you to be free." Clara nodded slowly, her shoulders straightening. She did not turn. Alice returned the letter to the box, locking it again and laying the key beside it. That night, Alice sat in the library long after the lamps had been extinguished, the fire burning low beside her. The letter remained with her in spirit, its words etched into her ribs. She did not tell Charles. It did not feel like her place. It felt sacred, meant for the daughters Eleanor left behind. But keeping that silence planted its own seed of doubt. And outside, in the city's drawing rooms and corridors of industry, a different kind of message had begun to spread. Victor Leland's whisper campaign had evolved into action. Articles began to appear in financial columns, subtle but pointed, questioning Whitmore and Sons' stability. Unconfirmed rumors tied Alice to an unnamed scandal in Albany. Anonymous letters circulated suggesting impropriety in the Whitmore household, alleging that Charles's grief had made him vulnerable to manipulation, that the woman now seen on his arm had ambitions far beyond her station. The effect was swift. Investors hesitated. One client withdrew from a contract. A bank postponed a line of credit. Inside the mansion, the tension became almost visible. Charles grew more withdrawn. Meetings multiplied. Telegrams came and went. The butler wore a tight expression. The staff moved in hushed tones. And Alice watched it all, powerless. One evening, as Charles returned late, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of his coat, she met him in the hall. The candlelight flickered across his features, making him look older than he had days before. "There's talk," he said. "I know." He studied her for a long moment. "They're using you." "Yes? Why haven't you said anything?" Her breath trembled. "Because the ones who already hate me wouldn't be convinced. And the ones who care shouldn't have to defend me." His jaw tightened. "You should have come to me." Alice stepped forward. "And what would you have done? Sent me away to quiet the rumors?" He said nothing. She lowered her gaze. "That's what they want, and I won't give it to them." He looked at her then, really looked. Not with anger, not with fear, but with something softer, something that unsettled him. And still, he turned away. That night, as she lay in bed, the letter in the music box echoed through her memory like the soft chime of a melody unfinished, a letter that offered grace. And yet, she wondered, was silence still an act of love, or the beginning of something else entirely? The arrival of spring brought little warmth to the Whitmore mansion. Though the days had grown longer and the ice had melted from the edges of Gramercy Park, the air within the house remained cold with a quiet tension, the kind that dwelled in unspoken truths and eyes that glanced away too quickly. Alice had learned to walk lightly. Her presence, once resented, was now tolerated, and in some moments cautiously welcomed. Yet she felt no true belonging. Not in the halls where the portraits still bore Eleanor's grace, nor at the table where conversations halted the moment she spoke of anything beyond the weather or Emily's lessons. The girls had grown quieter too, but not in the same way. Emily clung to Alice with increasing affection, asking for her during feverish dreams, reaching for her hand during evening prayers. Clara, however, kept her distance, watchful, guarded, not cruel, but still bound by something stronger than pride. Loyalty, perhaps, or memory. It was during a dinner at the Van Alstyne's townhouse that the storm began to shift. The event had been arranged weeks prior, a formal affair with silk-draped walls, imported French wines, and the city's most powerful men seated beneath chandeliers that sparkled like snow captured in crystal. Charles, as always, was the center of gravity. His silence commanded more attention than most men's voices. Alice stood at his side, in a gown of pale amethyst satin, her gloves pearl white, her hair gathered in a modest chignon. She had been unspoken for most of the evening. That changed when Victor Leland arrived. He entered with the confidence of a man who had not yet been unmasked. His charm spread quickly across the room, his compliments well placed, his laughter perfectly timed. Alice could feel the room shift as he approached, not because of admiration, but because of calculation. He stopped before her, his smile as sharp as polished glass. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his tone smooth, "it does the room good to have a touch of sincerity in it. I hear your presence has quite the effect on reputations." She met his gaze evenly. "I wasn't aware your interest extended beyond investments." "Oh, I find people far more profitable," he replied, "especially the ones who don't yet know how dangerous they are." A hush fell. Several guests turned toward them. One woman lowered her fan just enough to smirk. Charles stood nearby, locked in conversation with a railroad director. He had not heard. Alice's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "It's true," she said. "Reputations are fragile, especially when men build them on foundations of gossip and fear. But I find integrity outlasts them all." The silence that followed was loud. Victor's smile faltered. She added softly, "You'd know something about fragile foundations, wouldn't you, Mr. Leland?" He bowed slightly, eyes dark. "I look forward to our next conversation." "I imagine you will," she said, then turned away. Later that night, in the carriage ride home, Charles was quiet. Alice sat beside him, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The horses' hooves echoed against the damp streets, and the scent of early blossoms drifted in through the narrow window. "I heard what you said to Leland," Charles murmured finally. Alice did not look at him. "I'm sorry if I caused a scene." He was silent for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, "You didn't." When they returned home, Clara was still awake. She stood in the upper corridor, dressed in her nightgown and robe, her long hair loose over her shoulders. The gaslight from the wall lamp flickered across her face, casting half of it in shadow. "I saw the paper," she said. "They wrote that you were dangerous." Alice paused at the top of the stairs. "Yes." Clara looked at her directly. "They're wrong." The silence between them stretched. Alice stepped closer. "Why do you believe that now?" Clara's eyes filled slowly, not with tears, but with memories. "Because I saw the way my father looked at you tonight," she said. "And I remembered something, a night when I was younger. Mother had just returned from Boston. There had been some argument. I don't remember the words. But that night, he looked at her, just once, and he smiled." Alice held her breath. "I hadn't seen him smile like that again," Clara continued, "until tonight." She stepped forward. "I don't hate you anymore." Alice's throat tightened. "Clara, I'm still angry," she said quickly. "I still don't know what to do with All of this. But I saw what he saw, and I believe my mother would have wanted us to see it too. Alice reached for her hand. Clara didn't pull away. I'm not trying to take her place, Alice whispered. Clara's voice broke. I know. That night, Alice returned to her chamber with something she had not carried before. Hope. But hope is often followed by fear. The next morning, Charles summoned her to the study. He stood behind his desk, holding a folded newspaper in one hand. His face was unreadable. I received a letter this morning, he said, from a colleague in Boston. He's heard that Leland is pushing rumors about a letter, something that may compromise my name. A letter you've kept. Alice's heart stopped. Charles continued, he believes there's proof you've withheld information, that you're protecting someone, possibly yourself. She swallowed. There was a letter. It's true. He looked at her, eyes narrowing. From whom? From Eleanor, she said softly. That name, when spoken aloud, seemed to shift the air between them. He set the paper down. Why did I not know of this? Alice stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Because it wasn't for you. It was addressed to Clara and Emily. I found it in the music box. She wrote it for them, in case you ever found love again. His face changed. Not with anger, but with something deeper. Hurt, disbelief. And you kept this from me? I didn't think... He cut her off. You didn't think I had the right to hear my wife's words? No, she said quickly. I thought it wasn't mine to give. I didn't want to manipulate how you or your daughters felt. I wanted them to decide with their own hearts. And yet you kept the one thing that could have silenced half this city. Alice's eyes shimmered. I made a mistake, she said, but not one of betrayal. Charles turned away. The silence between them now felt colder than winter had ever been. Alice stood motionless, her hands trembling at her sides. I'm sorry, she whispered. He didn't answer. She left the study slowly. Her breath caught in her chest, the ache blooming through her ribs like frost on glass. And downstairs, behind the closed doors of the drawing room, the whispers grew louder. The rain had returned to New York, not in sudden storms or roaring tempests, but in a quiet, persistent drizzle that clung to rooftops and soaked the streets with sorrow. It painted the city in greys and silvers, and the wind that accompanied it carried the bitter chill of finality. Inside the Whitmore mansion, the fire crackled in the study, but its warmth failed to reach the man standing near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the garden path below. Charles Whitmore had not moved in several minutes. His reflection, ghost-like in the glass, looked older than the man he had been weeks ago. Alice stood across the room, her posture upright, though her voice had long since lost its strength. I told you the truth, she said quietly, her words trembling like lace in the wind. I kept the letter not to hide it from you, but to protect what it meant. Charles's jaw tensed. And yet you kept it. For the girls. For Clara. He turned toward her, his eyes unreadable. And for me. Did I not deserve to read my wife's final words? She stepped closer. They were not addressed to you. That house, this family, stands on trust, he said, voice low but sharp. And you let mine be chipped away by a man like Victor Leland. Do you have any idea what your silence cost me? Alice swallowed, her chest tightening. I never thought Victor would use her letter. I didn't know how far he'd go. You underestimated him, Charles snapped, and you overestimated your place in this family. The words struck her like a slap. Silence fell again, thick, suffocating. She steadied herself with a slow breath. Then say it plainly. If you no longer trust me, say it. Charles's eyes flickered. For the protection of my daughters, I must ask you to leave. Alice didn't speak. She didn't weep. She simply nodded. She turned and walked toward the door, her steps silent on the hardwood floor. At the threshold, she paused. I loved them, she whispered, with everything I had. And then she left. No one followed. No one called her name. In the entry hall, a maid handed her the small carpet-bag she had arrived with, aged leather worn at the corners, its weight pitiful for all it held. Alice wrapped herself in her navy cloak, the same one she had worn the day she first stepped into this house as a stranger, the same one that had clung to her shoulders during the rain in the garden, the same one that now would shelter her no longer. She opened the door into the afternoon rain and stepped outside. The street beyond was quiet, blurred by mist. The world, it seemed, had decided not to witness her departure. But someone had. Clara had been watching from the stairwell, and when she saw Alice's figure vanish down the path, something cracked open inside her chest. She ran. Barefoot, dressed still in her house slippers and morning dress, she ran down the corridor, past the butler who called her name, down the front steps and into the rain, her hair soaked within seconds, her breath ragged. "Wait!" Alice turned. Clara reached her with a gasp, her hands trembling, her cheeks wet with tears and rain alike. "You can't go." Alice looked at her, her heart aching. "Your father has asked me to." "He's wrong," Clara said, breathless. "He's angry, but he's wrong." She reached into the pocket of her skirt and pulled out the folded parchment, faded now, edges soft from having been read again and again. "Give him this," she begged. "Please, don't leave us like this." Alice took the letter slowly, her fingers trembling. The paper was damp now, stained with drops of water, but the words were still visible, still strong. "He needs to remember who she was," Clara said softly, voice cracking. "And who you are." Alice looked down at the letter, then back at Clara. "Take it to him." Clara's eyes widened. "I can't," Alice whispered. "He won't believe me, but he will believe you." Clara nodded, then threw her arms around Alice with a force that shattered the wall between them. They stood like that in the rain, one mourning what was lost, the other clinging to what still might be saved. When Alice turned to walk away again, Clara didn't follow. She returned to the house. She climbed the staircase, the letter clenched in her small hand, water pooling beneath her shoes. She found her father in the music room. He sat at the piano bench, unmoving, his back straight, his hands resting over his knees. The room smelled of polished wood and silence. Clara stepped inside. "Papa?" He didn't turn. She crossed the carpet slowly, standing beside him. "She didn't lie," she said. "Not to you, and not to us." He looked up at her then, eyes hollow, face pale. "She kept something sacred," Clara continued, "because she thought it wasn't hers to share, because she thought she was protecting us." Charles closed his eyes. "She was never a punishment," Clara whispered. "She was your second chance." She placed the letter in his hand and walked out without another word. Charles remained seated. He stared at the folded parchment in his lap, his fingers pressing lightly over Eleanor's seal. It was several minutes before he opened it, and when he did, the words inside broke him open. The ink blurred as he read. Tears he had not shed in 7 years fell freely now, unnoticed. And somewhere in the city, a woman walked alone beneath the rain, her heart heavier than her steps, not knowing if she would ever be called back, only knowing that for once she had been loved. The grey skies over Manhattan had darkened in the hours before dawn, but it was not the rain that stirred the streets near the East River, it was the smoke. Thick black plumes billowed into the sky, rising from the brick skeleton of the Whitmore and Sons East Foundry, the largest and oldest of Charles Whitmore's holdings. By the time the bells rang from the fire towers and men came running with buckets and shouts, the blaze had already swallowed the upper floor, and the air reeked of scorched iron, oil, and betrayal. At the mansion in Gramercy Park, Charles stood motionless as the butler handed him the telegram. He opened it with fingers steadier than he felt. Fire at East Foundry, suspected sabotage, major loss, awaiting your arrival. The paper crumpled slowly in his hand. His first thought was not of iron, or investment, or scandal. It was of Alice. And how, when he had cast her out, he had also cast out something else he had not dared to name, his only true ally. He arrived at the site less than an hour later, his greatcoat soaked in rain and smoke clinging to his collar. The fire had been extinguished, but the damage was clear. One wall had partially collapsed, the second floor was blackened, charred, machinery twisted in on itself like broken ribs. Dozens of workers stood about, silent and uncertain. Reporters were already on the fringes, their notepads ready, eyes keen for any sign of weakness. "Mr. Whitmore," came a voice behind him. "The inspectors are waiting." Charles gave a curt nod and walked toward the smouldering building. But before he reached the entryway, a figure emerged from the alley beside the brick wall. He stopped. Rain dripped from her bonnet. Her cloak, dark with moisture, clung to her shoulders. Her boots were soaked, and in her hand was a small oilskin-wrapped bundle pressed tightly against her chest. "Alice," he said, the name torn from him. She looked at him with a stillness he had not seen before. Not cold, not timid, resolute. "I have something you need," she said quietly. His eyes moved to the bundle in her arms. "It's proof," she continued, "and it's real." He opened his mouth to speak, but she was already walking past him, toward the crowd of city inspectors and factory foremen gathered under the canvas tarp. Her presence sent a wave of murmurs through the air, but she didn't flinch. She walked with the grace of someone who no longer feared the fire, only what might remain if it was left to consume everything. "This letter," she said, unwrapping the bundle and holding up a stained envelope, "was sent 3 weeks ago by Victor Leland to a former servant of this factory, promising payment in exchange for a disruption that would delay shipments and force a breach in your contracts with the Massachusetts syndicate." She laid the letter on the inspector's table. "There are more," she added, producing a ledger. "A servant loyal to the Whitmore family kept copies. He feared he might be blamed. He came to me 3 nights ago when he heard what had happened between me and your household." One of the men picked up the ledger, flipping through the pages. His brows rose. "These are bank records," he muttered. "Withdrawals from Leland's account, paid to a Silas Crane." "He was on your payroll, wasn't he?" Alice asked, turning to Charles. Charles nodded slowly. "Yes. Suspended last month for theft." The inspector looked up from the papers, his tone suddenly sharper. "If this is authentic, this isn't just sabotage. It's criminal conspiracy." There was silence. And then Charles spoke, not to the inspectors, but to Alice. "You knew this, and you came back." "I came back," she replied, "because this is still your name, your family's, Clara and Emily's future. I wasn't going to let him destroy it." His breath caught. Alice turned to leave, but he reached out, gently wrapping his fingers around her wrist. The rain fell harder. "Why?" he asked, his voice raw. She didn't pull away. "Because I never stopped protecting what I loved," she whispered. He searched her face, and something inside him fractured, not with pain, but with clarity. Victor Leland had set fire to a building, but Charles had nearly set fire to his own home by casting away the one soul who had never once betrayed him. "Stay," he said. "Please." She looked down at his hand, still wrapped around her wrist. "I can't come back as a guest," she said quietly, "or as a shadow of your guilt." He stepped closer. "Then come back," he whispered, "as my wife." A pause. Not for drama, but for meaning, for the weight of all that had passed between them. "I should have believed you," he said. "I should have fought for you, the way you fought for all of us." Alice's eyes shimmered. "I came alone," she said. "I had nowhere to go. I had no reason to believe you'd even listen." "I'm listening now." The rain softened, falling like a blessing over the ash. And under that grey sky, in the wreckage of brick and twisted steel, Charles Whitmore asked not for forgiveness. He asked for a beginning. Alice stepped into his arms, slowly, as if uncertain whether the warmth would remain. It did, and in the distance, beneath the edge of the tarp, one of the reporters lowered his notepad. Not every headline needed ink. Some stories wrote themselves in the silence after the fire. When they returned to Gramercy Park later that evening, the house seemed different, not louder, just less empty. Clara waited in the vestibule, her expression taut, but her arms open. Emily came running from the staircase, her cheeks flushed, her joy unhidden, and Alice, still in her damp cloak, knelt to receive the child's embrace. Charles stood at the threshold and looked into the home he had once built for grief. Now it stood waiting for love. No grand announcements were made. No proclamations. Just a quiet fire kindled in the hearth, and two hands finally joined without fear. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, the marble house did not echo with silence. It breathed, and in its walls the storm had finally passed. The first day of May dawned with a softness rare in New York. The skies above Gramercy Park were veiled in clouds the color of worn linen, and a light mist floated through the city, neither fully rain nor merely fog, just enough to coat the streets in silver and blur the hard lines of the world. Inside the Whitmore mansion, the air was scented with roses. Dozens of arrangements had been delivered since dawn, their petals trembling with dew, their colors gentle and blushing. Every corridor carried a hush, not of mourning this time, but of anticipation. The rose garden behind the mansion had been tended with meticulous care. The gardeners, working quietly under Mrs. Holbrook's supervision, had cleared the pathways of moisture and laid down soft woven runners so the guests would not sully their shoes. Petals had been scattered along the walkways, white, pale pink, and the softest peach, blending with the natural blooms that crowned the edges of every bed. A single wooden arch, entwined with climbing roses and ivory ribbon, stood at the heart of the garden. No organist had been hired, no orchestra summoned. Only the breeze would carry the melody, and the rain would play the prelude. Inside the house, Alice stood before the long mirror in Eleanor's former room, now hers, fully hers. Her reflection was unlike anything she had ever dared to imagine. Her gown, made of the finest silk tulle, was a quiet cream tinged with blush, as though it had been dipped in dawn. The neckline curved modestly at her collarbone, edged in delicate lace, while the sleeves clung to her arms with sheer elegance. Her hair was gathered in a low twist, adorned only with small ivory rosebuds and a single pearl pin that had once belonged to Charles's mother. She wore no jewels. Only the simple gold ring that Charles had given her weeks earlier in silence. No ceremony, no witnesses, just a promise made in the firelight of a living room where he had chosen her, not as penance, but as peace. Clara entered without knocking. She held a small silver mirror in her hands and said nothing at first. She looked at Alice for a long time, really looked. Then she crossed the room slowly and offered her the mirror. "You should see what we see," she said. "You look like a sunrise." Alice's throat tightened. Do you think she would be angry, Eleanor?" Clara shook her head. "She would be relieved." Then, without further ceremony, she reached for Alice's hand and clasped it gently. "Let's go." The guests gathered quietly under parasols and coats as the rain began to fall, not heavily, but with a steady rhythm, gentle and cleansing. No one complained. In fact, many seemed moved by it, as though the sky itself had decided to bless the occasion in its own quiet way. Among them were faces once hard with judgment, Senator Marwood and his wife, the Van Alstynes, even Mrs. Penrose, who had once crossed the street to avoid greeting Alice, now stood with gloved hands, folded, and eyes lowered in genuine respect. Charles stood beneath the arch, dressed in a tailored morning coat of slate grey, his waistcoat silver, his cravat knotted with perfect restraint. His expression was not one of stoic grandeur, as it had once been in business meetings and public appearances. It was open now, softened. Every breath he took was visible in the cool air. When Alice stepped into the garden, escorted not by a father, but by Clara and Emily, one on each arm, there was an audible sigh among the guests, not because of spectacle, but because of meaning. The three of them walked slowly down the rose-strewn path, the mist catching on their shoulders, the petals beneath their feet sticking delicately to the hem of Alice's gown. Emily gripped her hand tightly. Clara held her chin high. When they reached the arch, Charles stepped forward and took Alice's hand. She looked into his eyes and saw everything she had once feared would be lost. He lifted her veil slowly, his fingertips brushing the curve of her cheek. "You brought them back to me," he whispered. "You brought me back." Alice blinked, her lashes heavy with mist, her heart steady beneath her gown. "And you gave me a home," she replied. There were no vows read aloud, only a quiet prayer from the Reverend, a soft murmur of gratitude and grace, and the exchange of new rings, his hand trembling slightly as he slid the band over hers, her thumb pressing gently over his knuckles as she did the same. When the kiss came, it was not dramatic. It was reverent, as if they had both known for some time that this moment would come, and now they only had to lean into it gently, as one leans into warmth after a long season of cold. The guests clapped lightly. Some wiped away tears, and in the stillness that followed, the bells of Trinity Church rang faintly from downtown, carried on the wind like a hymn. Inside the house, the marble floors gleamed with candlelight. Music played softly from the parlor. Servants passed trays of warm cider and sweet tarts, but the heart of the celebration remained in the garden, where the rain continued to fall, soft and unyielding, soaking into the earth that had once borne only silence. Later that evening, when the guests had gone and the candles had burned low, Alice stood by the parlor window, watching the rain trace delicate lines down the glass. Charles came to her, his coat removed, his cravat loosened. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're still wearing the flowers," he murmured, noticing the rosebuds in her hair. "I wanted them to see me through the night." "They will," he said, "just like you saw me through mine." She turned to face him, and there, in the soft glow of the fire, no veil between them, no pain unsaid, they stood not as man and woman bound by duty or grief, but as two souls who had walked through fire and chosen to stay. And the house, once echoing with emptiness, was now filled with the quiet music of laughter, footsteps, and life. Above them, the rain whispered against the rooftop like a lullaby, but this time it did not mourn. It blessed. The spring of 1892 came early that year. Snow had melted by mid-March, and by April the roses in the back garden of the Whitmore estate were already budding with pale blush and deep velvet petals. The city had changed in 1,000 ways since that rainy May morning a decade ago. But from the window of her drawing room, Alice Whitmore still saw the world through the same veil of soft hope and quiet memory. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, as children's laughter echoed faintly from the garden. Her gaze lingered on the path that led through the arbor, the same one she had walked down with Clara and Emily at her side all those years before. The gravel had been replaced with polished flagstone, the roses pruned and replanted over time, but the memories remained intact, as vivid as the scent of rain on earth. A door creaked gently behind her. Charles stepped in, his cane tapping softly against the floor, his frame just a bit more stooped now, though still commanding in presence. His hair had greyed almost entirely, and his eyes, those deep storm-grey eyes, bore the gentleness of a man who had fought hard for peace and earned it. "She's up in the orchard again," he said with a smile, walking slowly toward her, refusing to come down. Alice looked up at him with warmth. "And James?" "With her, of course," he chuckled. "Carrying that wooden sword he insists is a real saber. I believe he plans to defend her honor," she smiled, "just like his father." He leaned down, kissed her temple, and settled into the chair across from hers. Their daughter, Eleanor Rose Whitmore, was 9 years old now, spirited, bright-eyed, and utterly fearless. And James, their younger son at 6, had inherited Charles's quiet strength and Alice's eyes. They were the joy of a home that had once known too much silence. Emily had grown into a graceful young woman, studying music and languages in Boston, but returning often to visit. She played the same piano in the music room where Alice had once been an outsider. Now she played there as a daughter. Clara had married a teacher from Columbia University, a kind and earnest man who loved books and believed women should be heard. She had chosen a life of purpose, not position. She now directed a reading program for immigrant girls in the Lower East Side, her name quietly respected in circles that once whispered behind fans. Victor Leland had not fared so well. After his public disgrace, he vanished from New York society. Rumors swirled: Paris, Havana, a failed enterprise in Argentina. No one knew for certain, but in the end, the city forgot him. And that, Alice once mused, was the cruelest punishment of all. The world itself had changed. The city pulsed with new machines, new voices, new tensions. The Gilded Age was gilded no more. Women spoke louder now. Men listened more carefully. Not all things were better, but many were. Enough to believe that change, like love, could take root in even the hardest ground. Charles reached for Alice's hand. His fingers curled gently around hers, the gold of his wedding ring gleaming in the afternoon light. 10 years, he said. She turned to him. 10 springs. He gave a slow, thoughtful nod. Sometimes I wonder how much more time we'll have. As much as we're meant to, she answered, and maybe a little more. Silence fell between them, comfortable and full. Outside, their children's laughter rose again, echoing through the garden. A breeze rustled the rose bushes. Somewhere above, the clouds parted just enough to let a ray of sunlight fall upon the old wooden arch where they had once renewed their vows. And for a moment, it felt as though time itself had paused, just long enough to remember, long enough to bless. Alice closed her eyes. She had been given away once, as punishment, but she had stayed by choice, and the life she had built, brick by brick, heart by heart, had become the kind of love that did not fade. It endured, and in that quiet garden, under the shelter of memory and rain, it bloomed again. And so, this is how Alice's journey, born of silence, forged in fire and crowned with love, came to its unforgettable end. But perhaps end is not the right word, because real love, the kind that endures time, judgment and loss, doesn't end. It transforms, it rebuilds, it teaches us that even what begins as punishment can become a blessing when we dare to stay, to forgive, and to believe in second chances. Alice was never chosen at first, but she chose love. And in doing so, she gave life to a home, to 2 grieving daughters, and to a man who had forgotten how to hope. This story reminds us that dignity often speaks in silence, that strength can look like tenderness, and that the rain we fear may one day become the rain that blesses us. If this tale touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who still believes in the power of slow-burning love and redemption. Let others feel what you felt. And if you made it all the way here, thank you truly. You're the reason these stories come to life. Write the word roses in the comments so I'll know you stayed with Alice until the final bloom. It helps the channel grow and brings more stories like this to those who need them. And if you're still holding on to this feeling, I left more beautiful period love stories in the cards above. You might just fall in love all over again. Until the next story, may your heart remain open, and may love like spring rain always find its way back to you.